Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to the 18th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Human Dignity at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. And what a debate we're going to have today, because what is happening in UK seems to encompass all of those issues. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished panel and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the button at the bottom of your screen. That is the Q&A button. Please do not use the chat button. The questions will come to me during the session, and I will try to put them to the panel towards the end of the debate in a reasonable order for them to consider. We urge you to ask your questions, please, as soon as you can, and I will try and put as many as possible to the panel later. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sandy and to the other panelists and look forward, like you do, to the debate. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you very much, Mike, and happy to be working together again with you and with our excellent panelists today. We've been doing this, we started this early in the pandemic, thinking it would be a way to keep our images flying despite all the difficulties in communication. And it's become something that many people have depended on. And we have frequent people who come back not only to watch these conversations live, but also to view them again later online. A wonderful panel it is we have today. Raymond Asquith, who was a longtime member of the British Foreign Service and served in both Moscow and Kyiv at critical moments, and is now an independent crossbencher in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. Susan Eisenhower, on my screen, she appears just above Raymond. One never knows where people are going to show up on the screen. Susan Eisenhower, here in Washington, a nationally known policy analyst and commentator on these matters of international affairs. She has, in the past and in the present, been the chair and member of many advisory boards to government agencies, the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College in Pennsylvania, and has written literally hundreds of columns about international matters of importance. Christopher Preble he co-directs the New American Engagement Initiative at the Atlantic Council. He is an American historian and has had much to say during the Ukraine conflict. We're also joined by Hugo Slim from Las Casas Institute at Oxford at Blackfriars Hall, who is a great expert on international affairs, but especially on the rehabilitation from crises and the recovery from circumstances that were not anticipated, which I think we can all say this conflict includes. I want to begin just very briefly by asking our panelists, and perhaps we could ask Raymond Asquith to begin for us to talk about whether are we where we expected to be. I think it's almost 3 months now that there's been a shooting war in Ukraine. It's a shooting war in which many countries are participating without actually doing the shooting. And we have also sort of some tourism going on in Kyiv now, with members of various governments flying in to check out the war, which certainly seems like a new frontier in this this situation. So are we where we expect it to be, and what might we expect, and when should we expect it? I'd like everybody to comment on this, but let's start with Raymond.
It's difficult to say whether we are where we expect it to be. I would start by saying that all the information and intelligence we have shows that this whole crisis started to mature, if you can call it that, back in July or August of last year. And a lot of analysis went in our respective foreign ministries and defense ministries into the content of Putin's speeches and his writings. And I would say that this crisis kicked off seriously in about August of last year, when Putin started to talk about Ukraine being an annex, an appendix, and not a real state, and so on and so forth, and started to develop his own sort of ideological views on what Ukraine is and why it shouldn't be there. So I think we've had a lot of preparation for this. And I would say that on the whole, the Western democracies have prepared very well for it. We have been training the Ukrainians for a very long time. The United States and the United Kingdom have had very close military training processes with the Ukrainians since back in 1983 or 84. So we've had 20 or 30 years of training with them. Of course, the fear was that Putin's predictions that he would take Kiev in 3 months or 3 days were very, very pronounced, but we didn't really expect him to do so. So I think that's as far as I can say at the moment as to whether we are where we expected to be. We are where we hoped to be, and when it'll end, I couldn't possibly predict.
Susan.
Well, you know, it's a really good question. I would just say, in terms of where we hope to be, let's look at what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had a policy in the 1990s. Well, I should say, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, George H.W. Bush actually supported the Soviet Union staying together, because he was tremendously worried about a failed state with nuclear weapons. Okay, we'll put that there. Then I think the other thing in terms of how long we've had on this issue is that our strategy was to build a Europe whole and free. And we haven't succeeded at that either. So you might say this is the sort of end game, actually, of a set of ideas we had that didn't pan out. I say that without judgment. I'm just saying it depends on how long your timeline is and deciding whether this is where we want to be or not.
Chris.
Well, if I can speak for Vladimir Putin, because we would say, are we where we thought we would be? I certainly don't expect, I don't think that he expected this war to be grinding on. It'll be 3 months next week. He expected that the government in Kiev would quickly collapse, in addition to being able to consolidate territory in eastern Ukraine beyond what Russia had already held at the start of the invasion. And I think many military histories and dissertations will be written on why those assumptions on Putin's part were wrong. The other thing that we've seen play out, which I think is contrary to expectations, was the supposedly vaunted Russian misinformation, disinformation, mischief, cyber, etc., being able to shape the narrative, at least with respect to the US and the West. And I think it's a different story in the global South, but at least in the US and the West, I think that the story that he wanted to be believed among the world on what this special operation was and what it actually was, the truth has come out and been revealed to those who are watching. It is clearly an invasion. It is an act of aggression. It is nothing else other than that. Again, the story that is being told elsewhere in the world is somewhat different, and yet his ability to shape that narrative has been demonstrated maybe even more ineffective than his own military.
Hugo, your thoughts on this? Did you expect the amount of devastation that we've seen already taking place?
Well, I thought there might be more. I mean, I'm so pleased that the Ukrainians have proved to be so good at fighting and the Russians have proved to be so bad at fighting. And I think that's incredibly good news for the Ukrainian people and the country, because there is no doubt the other thing that we expected and has come to pass is that in areas that are occupied and, you know, potentially annexed by the Russians, we know they will be extremely brutal. They will detain people, they will do summary executions, their soldiers will probably rape, and they will deport. So I think it could have been a lot worse, much more quickly. And thank heavens for the preparation that Raymond mentioned by Western allies to support Ukrainian armed forces and their courage in seeing off the Russians and for Russian inefficiency. Otherwise, I think we'd be in a much worse place. But I think the other thing that perhaps we anticipated, I don't know what was going on in the halls of power and government, but I think the fact that, I think we always knew that Putin would play with the gas tap and we were going to have to take a major hit on gas prices and scrabble for gas provision. I think the food prices thing, I think the encirclement and creating a landlocked state in Ukraine, which was obviously one of Putin's early goals, has been fairly devastating for the whole world. And I think I was listening to the EU the other day saying that they estimate 1.7 billion people will be affected directly by food price hikes and shortages from the blockade of the southern coastal ports of Ukraine and the sanctions on Russian grain. So we have that major problem that has come to pass, but I'm heartened by Ukrainian defense.
What is our wisdom at the moment about what Putin will do if he's not doing as well as he expected to? And I think that most people feel he must be disappointed with the performance of his forces and by his inability to carry out his threats and predictions so neatly. What do we expect of him now? And what of these threats that he's made repeatedly to revert to nuclear weapons? I think people think he meant tactical nuclear weapons, but I'm not sure anyone knows for sure about that. How serious is that threat, and how confident can Western leaders be that they can tighten the blockade, tighten the sanctions without running that risk? Susan, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I've spent a long part of my career in the arms control community. And of course, one of the things that's keeping us awake at night, quite literally, are the use of tactical or strategic nuclear weapons. I don't think that he would launch a strategic weapon, but the circumstances are very different today and frankly more dangerous than they were during the Cuban Missile Crisis for a couple of reasons. First of all, we are not in direct negotiations with Russia on this. Also, we have cyber warfare, which and more than 1,000 freelancers who think that they're out there helping Ukraine when in fact they could be putting together some spoofing plan. The Russians don't have a very good early warning system because it's still not completely fully built out after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the possibility that they might misinterpret some kind of weapon coming their way could be a direct threat. And then, finally, we don't know that very much about what Putin's attitude is. I don't think that he's irrational, putting aside many of the things we hear about, the potential of poor health on his part. But it is a very, very dangerous situation. And then add to that, we've got 5 nuclear powers involved. That's not the way it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and possibly China. And that makes, and I don't think there's nearly enough attention on this subject. So thanks for the question.
Raymond, are you as concerned as Susan is about that?
Yes, I am. I think she gave a very good answer. I mean, you know, the instinctive response is to say that these threats of nuclear or anyway tactical missile attacks are just a sign of his weakness, and they certainly are that. But it's very clear that what Putin is now trying to adjust to is to turn this into a war against NATO. And if it's a war against NATO, it's not on NATO territory. And therefore, if he wants to pursue this, would it be surprising if he turned it to NATO territory? And that, I think, is what we have most to worry about, because the whole narrative of the war is changing, not completely, not altogether, but it's changing from denazification of Ukraine and the fact that the Ukrainians are our brothers and sisters to the Russians, and they will fall into our arms, and we're liberating them. It's now, in Putin's rhetoric and in Lavrov's rhetoric, it's turning into this is a proxy war against NATO. So if that's the case, it's difficult to predict, but we should be very concerned. And what I don't know is how in government, both the United States and the United Kingdom and other NATO states governments, how this question is being framed in terms of what we do to deter such threat.
An interesting perspective, and especially given the fact that both Sweden and Finland, I think to many people, surprise recruits to self-recruits to NATO, want to join the alliance. Chris, how do you see that playing out? It seems to be aggravating Putin even more.
Well, it speaks to the strategic blunder that the war in Ukraine is and has been for Vladimir Putin, because the shift in public opinion in both Sweden and Finland since the buildup of forces, and then even more dramatically after the Russian invasion, is something that I don't think anyone would have predicted even 7 or 8 months ago. Certainly Vladimir Putin does not relish, as much as he didn't relish the idea of NATO in the Baltic states or eventually NATO in Ukraine, he certainly also doesn't relish the idea of NATO forces being in the long Finnish Russian border. So I think that the reaction of the Finns and the Swedes to the Russian invasion is dramatic. The reaction of other NATO states, I mean, Germany's reaction within a few days of the invasion, not just cutting off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, or at least freezing it indefinitely, but also announcing dramatic increases in military spending, is another thing that never would have been anticipated before the invasion. So I think that to the extent that Mr. Putin had some sort of strategic vision that he thought was going to play out as a result of this invasion, it is, I would argue, exactly the opposite of what he wanted or hoped for.
Hugo, is it a good thing for NATO to find new members at this point? Do you see that as helping focus the response and the reaction to recovery from this war as well?
I think it's fairly inevitable. Sorry, was that me?
No, you carry on.
Yes.
No, Raymond, you know this much better than me. You go for it.
No, you answer. Sorry, I thought.
No, I think it's an inevitable trend. I mean, I think if we look at the whole of the last 20 years, people prefer not to be orbiting around Moscow in any way. So this idea that, NATO has been pushing to the east is not strictly true. I think, the east has been pulling over to the west because nobody wants to be, in a Moscow organization of any kind. So I think it's just the last 2 bits in a way that are saying, no, we'd rather be with this imperial power over here than that one. And I think that's what's going on in a way.
And yet, I'm sorry,
Hugo, can I put, are those the only 2 plausible alternatives, domination by Russia or domination by the United States? Because it seems to me that
I wasn't talking about the US empire so much as the European one, actually.
Fair enough, because I do think that the prospect for some kind of security relationship and arrangement that was in addition to or separate from NATO has never really been seriously considered. And I think this is a path not taken and at least worth exploring at some point. Maybe not. Maybe now isn't the right time to do it. But I think, in light of what has happened, not just over the last few months, but it wasn't so long ago that we had a president in the Oval Office who was suggesting that the Article 5 commitment of the United States was up for debate and negotiation, depending upon who was willing to throw him a parade or throw some money in his direction.
Yeah.
I think also we've got to be considering the fact that at least a big part of the world, the Western world, thinks that China is the ultimate threat. So the real question is, aren't we going to have to find some new way rather than maybe in addition to the NATO bloc? I don't know, but this is the 800-pound gorilla that's sitting in the middle of this strategic discussion, I think.
If I could just say about, what has Putin achieved in his war so far? He has achieved, firstly, the unification of Ukraine, north, south, east, and west. I would say, secondly, he's helped to rearm Germany.
Mm-hmm.
He's achieved the accession, probably, of Finland and Sweden. He has facilitated the task of democratic governments to persuade their citizenries to pay higher taxes for green energy. And he has inaugurated, in my living memory, he's inaugurated a bipartisan politics in Washington. And at the same time, he has consolidated worldwide hostility against Russia. Were any of these in his war aims? Hardly. So when you ask, is it a threat that Finland and Sweden are likely to become members of NATO, I would say that result will not be wasted ultimately in Moscow. Whether or not Mr. Putin understands that, others will. And I think it's worthwhile reinforcing the failures of the strategic objectives which he has misguidedly or unintentionally put in motion.
Let me ask Chris or anyone else whether there is a serious dissident bloc within NATO. I'm thinking about Hungary, which seems to be attached to Mr. Putin and
Right.
perhaps others. Is that something anyone has to worry about?
Well, I guess worry to a certain extent. Turkey has also made some preliminary noises
Right.
about wanting to, and again, we've seen Turkey play this role in the past where, offer up some reservations in exchange for some sort of other concession, which is always a possibility. And in the case of Hungary, I haven't heard a similar sort of if this then that sort of thing. But this gets to my point about is a larger NATO a more effective NATO? I think that is another question worth asking, because again, this is an organization that operates on the basis of consensus, unanimity, and while right now within NATO the consensus is that Russia is a acute and urgent threat, to Susan's earlier point, it wasn't so long ago, it may not be so long from now, that most urgent threat is something else. Again, not so long ago in Europe South, it was refugees coming from Middle East, North Africa, and then going back to before the invasion, the notion that China was going to be the threat. So how difficult, to your point, to your question, Sandy, how difficult will it be in the future to maintain that sort of cohesion in a 31 or 32 member alliance, as difficult as it has been to do so in a 29 or 30 member alliance?
Can I just offer another cohesion question? Yes, we're all shocked actually that the Republicans and the Democrats have finally got it together around some issue, but I would think that might fray as well. 57 members of the Republican Party are already objecting to sending more aid to Ukraine. And I think the biggest thing that's going to be a problem is that we don't have hearings on any of this stuff anymore. I mean, this is a uniquely domestic gripe, but Congress even is blindsided by some of what goes on. So I think as we get into the midterm elections and then the the big one, which is going to be the presidential election in 2024, you could see some fraying around the consensus on this, especially allocating an emergency Article 5 to one country that has a very long border with Russia, and by the way, played a very threatening role to Russia during World War II. I just add to this that Vladimir Putin grew up in Leningrad, and anybody who wants to, read a real book, boy, read about the siege of Leningrad. So his perspective on all this is really quite different.
I'm sure that's right. And he might have some particular thoughts about Finland as well.
Exactly. That's my point. Yeah.
Coming from Leningrad. Of course, quickly expanded alliances may fray very easily, and I think that's something that will not be easy to deal with afterwards. Wait, are there limits? Do we think that in the Western countries that have been supportive of this whole endeavor, that there are limits to how long and how far people are going to be willing to go with gas, petrol prices, for example, with some of the economic sanctions? I've been hearing some stories on the side about people who need to export some things that seem quite benign, but are running across bureaucratic obstacles to that too. Is this emergency situation? How long does an emergency last in a case like this? Chris or Hugo?
No, Hugo,
please.
go ahead. Hugo, go ahead.
I would just chip in and say, I think it's going to be a long haul, and I think it will get more difficult for different people at different times. But I think, I accept everything that Raymond's saying about what Putin has achieved against his own interests. But I think he's probably quite happy with having completely sort of ruptured Ukraine as a functioning state in some way that can join anything at the moment. I think he's in it for the long haul. I think he's going to, just keep plugging away and making a really bad, difficult situation all over the East and as much around the South as he can. I think he'll be trying to annex as much as he can as he goes. And if his troops do sort of take positions and are then able to hold them, then it's more difficult for the Ukrainians to attack well-defended places. So in a sense, he's probably happy at one level to create a sort of West Bank situation of a sort of creeping annexation, destabilized area on that side of Ukraine and as much of the South Coast as he can, and just keep it like that. So yeah. I think that's a win for him in terms of effectively creating Ukraine as a bit of a permanently failed state at the moment. And he can do that for a decade.
Yeah. To Sandy's original question is, how long can emergency last? We'll ask the Israelis, because the Israelis have effectively been operating under an emergency since the foundation of the state. And so I think, again, there is a threshold beyond which presumably, and again, we're just sort of presuming, there's a threshold beyond which Vladimir Putin will conclude that this war is not worth fighting, but we have not come close to that threshold. And to me, the grinding sort of steady war in the East, which is, mostly an artillery war and just horrifically damaging, is not as damaging as the first few weeks of the campaign was to his military. Again, I sort of marvel at the losses of Russian troops relative to other major military operations the Russian army has conducted. I mean, 15,000 dead in 2.5 months versus maybe 25,000 in 8 years of fighting in Afghanistan. It's just staggering. But if he is able to settle into what Hugo said, sort of creating facts on the ground without incurring those incredibly hard losses and sort of really reducing the fighting effectiveness of the Russian army, then I could see this tragically dragging on for a long time. And the other point that I wanted to make is that economically, the economic pain that is being imposed on Russia, which is severe, will that be sufficient to convince him to change course? And I think that is at best an open question.
The one thing that I keep wishing I knew the answer to is what is the conversation going on in official circles? I'd love to know what cultural underpinnings or what cultural assumptions they're making about Russia and the rest of it. This is a country that knows how to suffer. And actually suffering has a way of bringing them together rather than splitting them apart. Now, I do think that there are changes because of social media and a new generation wants to be part of the world, rightly so. But Putin is appealing to this siege mentality, which they have in cultural spades. So if anybody's got any other insights into what assumptions are being brought at our level, I mean, we think that sanctions work. Actually, sanctions have never been that successful to begin with. So I agree. I don't know where this is going, except the grinding part, forever grinding part.
I think if you go on, I mean, the Russian military doctrine is pretty crude, and it normally requires flattening everything in front of them, which they've done successfully in Kherson, or partly successfully, although it's still hanging on. They've done in Mariupol. But you can't grind on in the Donbass in the east, and Donetsk and Luhansk, and smash everything to pieces and still maintain the narrative that you're liberating your Russian speakers from Ukrainian Nazis. If he's going to grind on in the Donbass and flattens it all to pieces, then you've lost just about everything that requires a moral justification for a war. And of course, he doesn't call it a war. But anyway, most military analysts would separate out three categories in a war: what they call the physical, which means the kit and the people, or the kit; the conceptual, which means what they call the training; and the moral, which is the justification. And he's clearly failed on the moral side now, and he's clearly failed on the conceptual side, which is the incompetence of his commanders. So I think we are in this for the long haul, but it may not just be the Donbass, as it were, the eastern part. The greatest threat to Ukraine at the moment is the blockade in the Black Sea. And that's its greatest, if he can maintain that threat, and I mean, I think he's got some 40 warships which are blockading about 80 commercial ships in the Black Sea. And that obviously was one of his objectives. War aims was to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea, where it exports almost all its grain and its coal and its metals. There will come a point, though, when Ukraine, I believe, will aim to create a coalition of well-wishers, whether the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Sweden, maybe Greece, possibly Turkey, even less likely perhaps, in which they will want to free up under the law of the sea, the maritime law of the sea. They will want to impose some kind of coalition to enable commercial and economic activity to continue in the Black Sea. And that, I think, is where there'll be a big diplomatic wrangle about this. There'll be a big diplomatic dispute as to the extent to which, under international law, well-wishers of Ukraine will impose or try to impose the lawful activity of commerce in the Black Sea. And that, I think, is where there'll be a real clash on Ukraine's future.
And one perhaps that we're not attuned to at the moment. I want to try to hit a few more points quickly before we go to take questions from our audience. Is there any hint, any inkling that Putin may be losing support for this war at home? Do we have any way of knowing? Has outside media coverage of this war, however good we think it is or not, managed to penetrate the Russian frontier more than we think it has? Does anyone have a sense of that?
I don't think we know. I think there's a lot of wishful thinking, and there's a lot of completely optimistic thinking about a coup against Putin. I really don't see evidence that we know.
Well, this is actually what, I know that this isn't a vogue thing to say, but if we do have nuclear weapons involved, and we feel, on my worst moments, I feel like we're on the verge of a world war because we've got all these big players on the scene. People often compare this to World War II. I do not see that. We didn't have nuclear weapons during World War II until the very end. This feels a little more like World War I, where you've got all
Yes.
the big powers in play and all of them have different interests. At the moment, mercifully, our alliance is holding together here. But I guess what continues to concern me is, given the fact that we do have sophisticated weapons that couldn't have even been imagined during the World War II period, that we aren't doing more to get somebody to just start talking. And maybe this is a girl talking here, I'm sorry, but this whole situation has been the most unheard, undialogued crisis I've ever seen in my professional career. And since we were on the verge of trying everything else, I don't see what harm there would be in getting the United Nations or somebody to play some kind of a role just in talking, because that would certainly be more stabilizing than what we're going on right now.
Anyone have any thoughts about that? Anyone want to volunteer some suggestions of people who might be able to somehow find a wedge into this situation, try to have some real peace talks instead of some of the charades that I think went on in the earliest days?
Andy, I should add that I don't necessarily have much hope that they would yield anything in the short term. But I think it's irresponsible to the rest of the world, especially when you think of what the overarching impacts are going to be economically. I don't know if you read the piece the other day about Egypt's problems because they import so much grain from that part of the world. I mean, we could have not a global recession, a global depression, and not even to make an effort to get somebody to start some talks that would be more stabilizing than what we've got at the moment. I just don't get it. I wish I did, but
Chris, you're shaking your head. Do you have
Well,
any nominees?
No, unfortunately not. I think the reason why there has not been serious dialogue in the course of this conflict so far is that neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians see the benefit in dialogue. The Ukrainians see, and so wars end in negotiations when one or both parties conclude that the fighting isn't worth it any longer. And I think we're not anywhere near that stage in this conflict, tragically, most importantly.
I'm not talking about a resolution.
Yeah,
I'm talking about sheer talk.
No, and I look, Susan, I completely understand with that. I mean, the one thing I was going to say, going back to the very beginning, for all of the many crises over the course of the Cold War that involved two nuclear armed states, very few such crises actually involved a core security interest of one or the other parties. And so as difficult, and it was difficult for Dwight Eisenhower in 1956 or Lyndon Johnson in 1968 to look at Hungary and to look at Czechoslovakia and say, this is not worth going to a shooting war with the Russians over, that is not, and again, President Biden's initial reactions sort of echoed that sentiment, right? I mean, saying we will not get into a shooting war with the Russians. That was what he said in late January, early February, before the war even started. And so, this is a nuclear crisis in the sense that both parties or all parties, if they judge that this is a truly existential danger, then that's where those sorts of the contemplating the use of nuclear weapons doesn't suddenly seem so absurd, which thankfully it has been up to this point.
Yeah.
Before we drift over to Mike and ask about some of the questions that have come in, I do want to raise the question of whether we are well informed enough about what's really happening in this war. Have the media served us well? Does the old saw kick in that truth is the first casualty of wartime? That there's a little too much excitement about the Ukrainians and the progress they've made. They've been very brave and very bold. Yeah. And many people admire President Zelensky tremendously, talking about somebody one might not have expected to be able to handle a situation like this. But do we know as much as we need to know when we have so much at stake and so much is happening? How could the media do a better job, perhaps, on covering this war? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Hugo?
So I think we know the propaganda of both sides. I mean, I think it's very clear the Russians are lying in their basic narrative. They're not really revealing publicly the extent of their losses. They are sort of announcing change strategies and tactics every now and again. I think it's also clear that the Ukrainians are extremely good at managing their communications. I think they've got the world on their side, a lot of the world, not some big powers and big leaders, but they've done that. But again, we don't know exactly much about Ukrainian casualties and the way they're suffering and the way they're being organized. They're keeping some things deliberately quiet because they need to be quiet about them. But we don't know everything. And going back to the peace discussions, I don't think we know the back channels, which I hope are there around nuclear weapons. And we don't know the back channels that might be being run through the Turks and others. So there's a lot we don't know, but that's normal, I think. We don't, on the humanitarian side, we don't know in depth. We know about movements of population and even returns of population now, which is great news. We don't know about the extent of hardship and suffering yet. But we'll see. And we're going to learn a lot more about war crimes, I think, from those investigations that are now going on in liberated areas. So I think it's patchy, but I mean, I think the propaganda is pretty absolute on both sides.
I agree about the propaganda on the Russian side. I have to say that I think there's a lot of stuff coming out. I run a couple of platforms for Ukrainian refugees coming to the United Kingdom, and we see a lot of these people and we hear a lot of their stories. And those stories are being corroborated by Western press and Ukrainian press on the ground. So I think on the whole, the stories coming out from the Ukrainians, from the media and direct personal stories are not distorted. I mean, I'm not saying the Ukrainian military might not conceal.
No, I was meaning military accounts rather than civilian detail, yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're getting pretty good, accurate and verifiable reporting or verified reporting on the Ukrainian side, almost nothing on the Russian side. There's quite a lot of, I mean, our own Ministry of Defense is very careful not to put out over-optimistic or over-wishful thinking bulletins. They are pretty measured, in my view, on what they're reporting or trying to be pretty balanced. So I don't think truth has been the first casualty of war at the moment is a real problem within Ukraine. I mean, the trouble is truth has been the first casualty of peace within Putin's Russia, and that's a problem for us.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the war, there was something unseemly. I think viewing it online at the beginning, watch the war live with us, rival. And it was almost like, flashing lights. We'll do a better job of giving you live coverage of the world's newest war than our competitors will. I'm not sure that served the interest of truth. We won't know, I suppose, for some time.
Yeah, when you say the press, Cindy, I think of the old-fashioned press, which is to say, reporters. We used to call them print reporters, right?
Right.
And so I think that they have the major news organizations, not the television and cable news necessarily, but I think the major news organizations have covered themselves well. I think there is a tendency to overinterpret military progress on the basis of public source information. And to Raymond's point, that really does require the experts to sort of temper the enthusiasm for saying, look at the effectiveness of this weapon system against this Russian vehicle, what have you, and then to conclude, therefore, again, to overinterpret.
There's a lot of criticism of the use of military metaphor in covering sports, and I think we now are seeing some sports metaphors in the covering of a war, which seems quite unseemly. And I mean, everybody was at the Washington Post was saying, "Watch the war live with us," and I think the New York Times was as well. But I suppose if this settles down and another winter comes, it will be a very different situation.
Oh, yeah.
Let's ask Mike Scott, if he's ready to take some questions from our audience and present them to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Been very interesting 3/4 of an hour or so. A question's come in from Paul Williams. Hello, Paul. He says, what is the panel's views on the legitimacy of Russia's arguments that the West / NATO was increasingly threatening Russia's security in one way through its courting of the Ukraine? Raymond, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, I will, because this is quite close to my view analysis, really. I mean, I personally don't think that in reality, the Russian-Ukrainian war has much connection with the possible accession of Ukraine to NATO. In the first case, it's now well established that long before the 24th of February, that Ukraine will not be allowed to accede to NATO. And that was in the foreseeable future. And that was publicly declared both in NATO capitals and in Kiev, that NATO accession was not a foreseeable reality. It wouldn't happen. Secondly, I would say that about 90% of the Ukrainians now recognize that Putin is not so much afraid of NATO as that what he's really afraid of is the trajectory on which Ukraine wants to develop. That is as a free, prosperous, and largely democratic state. And just as Poland has done over the last 20 years. And I would say that that position of Ukraine, that it wants to develop as a free and prosperous state, is in complete opposition to the status quo obtaining in Russia. And it is in contradiction to and refutation of the kind of state that Putin has built or wants to model for people. Now, Putin frequently says that Russia faces an existential threat from NATO, although that's just not the case. What it does, his statement is true in one sense only, that he has identified himself so closely with the future of Russia, it's almost his identity, that Ukraine developing in the way that it wants, in the trajectory it wants to take, is actually an existential threat to Putin's state model. And that state model is becoming increasingly ludicrous and worthless. And I think it's, finally, I'd say a proportion of, let us say, ordinary Russians are beginning to recognize that Putin is not so frightened of NATO. He's frightened of Ukraine developing into a prosperous nation. And that, I think, puts into context, really, a lot of the rhetoric about NATO. I mean, we say we're not an aggressive organization, NATO is not an aggressive organization, and then Putin will come back and say, what did you do to Serbia, and so on and so forth. But fundamentally, the problem is not NATO's actions or supposed putative actions against Russia. It's much more the development of a Ukrainian community, the Ukrainian state in opposition to the model that obtains in Russia. And that's quite provocative.
You're nodding there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think, and if you read the Russian national security policy that came out last year, it's all about Western values and Westernization and resisting Western culture and values. And that's where his alliance with Patriarch Cyril comes in too. And I think it's really, as Raymond has said, it's about that. And there's something particularly abhorrent for Putin and Cyril and in their ideology that apparently sacred part of Russian history and Russian land would go towards Western values and Western culture. So I think that's why it becomes a rather bizarre, sacred sort of conflict in their mind. And I agree totally that NATO's increasingly the narrative, as was explained earlier, but the crisis is about losing Ukraine to Western values and Westernization, as it were.
Do you think that the West made some fundamental mistakes after the fall of the wall and the fall of the Soviet Union in not respecting the heritage of Russia, and that has caused any of the problems. Susan, do you got any ideas about that?
I don't think it is related to the heritage. I think it relates to the, you might say, misunderstanding or the understanding or whatever of what happened at the 2+4 talks. I had the opportunity to interview Mikhail Gorbachev personally. I was the only, I guess, reporter, you'd say, who was there, except one other person to verify what was said. But you know, he was left with the very strong feeling that the agreement was that NATO would not move, not move east if Germany were to be allowed to be in NATO. And he told me that he felt swindled. He used the word swindled that is used for, there are 3 words that mean swindled in Russian, but the one he chose was the one that is when a friend of yours swindles you. So that was a wow moment. And then he went on to say that if he had had any idea that NATO would expand, and remember the Warsaw Pact was still in place, he said he would not have agreed to the unification of Germany. So, you know, I'm just reporting that. But I think this reading of what happened at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union has filtered down through their leadership and among their elites. So it's just, you know, maybe a something that's useful for, if not anything else, then for historic reasons.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank
Can
you for
I,
that.
can I
Yes,
say
Christopher. Yeah.
on the
sorry.
issue of Ukraine, among the many tragedies of this story, is the reality now, it appears, that Ukraine must choose. Ukraine can only have good relations either with Europe or with Russia. And that may be the case now and forever into the future. But that was not the only option available to the Ukrainians. And I think for many Ukrainians, and it wasn't just cultural and historical, but it was also economic, right? The importance of Russia as a trading partner to Ukraine was absolutely critical, just as Ukraine was increasingly drifting towards Europe, both culturally and economically as well. And so sort of closing this war, if this war has closed off the possibility of Ukraine having ever having productive relations with Russia, that will be an additional tragedy for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian people.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to one from this coming from Ted Kennedy, who lives up in Cumbria. Reporters say that a large proportion of the Russian population support Putin, partly as a result of government control of the media. What efforts are being made by the West to supply evidence to that population? Hugo, do you want to have a go at that from the start?
I don't actually, I haven't really got a clue. So I think the others will have a much better idea probably.
Okay, well,
Well,
it's just because you hadn't answered being on the last question. Raymond, back to you.
well, I think, the Ukrainians are absolute world-class geniuses at cyber communication. They are brilliant, and they've been able to hack in to a number of Russian state channels and have broadcast or streamed what I would regard as accurate reportage of what's going on. And they've also somehow infiltrated themselves into the Polish national channels and streamed material also into the Russian TV and radio stations. How effective that is, I'm not sure, but it's beginning to get through, and that is probably the only way it will get through.
Mike, I might chip in here, as you know, for a period of 2 years back at the turn of the century, I ran the Voice of America, and it was still a preoccupation in 2000 to figure out how to reach people behind what used to be the Iron Curtain. And we used to tell ourselves that we were doing it, we and some of the other radios, certainly including the BBC and certainly including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, but we never really had any direct proof of the impact. It's cultural matters during the Cold War, jazz, things like that were fantastically successful in penetrating the Soviet bloc. But whether real news of what was happening in the world was getting through has always been very difficult to tell, and probably is just as difficult to tell now.
Yeah, I used to live next to a radio jammer in Moscow, and your news certainly didn't come through.
I believe it.
Oh,
Yeah, okay. Angela Preston asks, even if the Ukraine wins the war, Russia will have devastated much of Ukraine, schools, hospitals, homes, and government buildings. To prevent this, who is talking about and insisting on peace? And another question came in to say, what happens afterwards? Who's going to pay for all of this? Who's going to build these hospitals again and get the schools going again?
well, I'd like
Susan?
to at least start out by saying that Putin cannot win for having done what he's done. And I think we all have to be very clear on that point. This is no matter what his grievances are, and I'm not going to evaluate them here because I think over exaggeration would be how to put it on a good day. I mean, there's really no excuse at all for what he's done. So he can't get out of this scot-free. But if we've completely, if the Russian economy is completely flattened in the process of a long war where we continue to keep sanctions on, then it's hard to know, aside from using the money we have that we've frozen, you know, we're going to have to probably, I think, the international community is going to have to step up to the plate. I don't think that, you know, politically you would be able to sell the United States doing this alone. I'm sure you couldn't sell it in Britain. So this is going to take an international effort to restructure that economy, and rightly so.
Hugo?
Yeah, my impression is that that's already sort of in the planning, and people at, you know, the World Bank and the IMF are beginning sort of to think about how that might work and what sort of fund or trust fund or whatever you might need to do that, Susan. So I think, you know, I think on the whole, there will be massive continuing investment and reinvestment in Ukraine the moment it's sort of possible and wherever it's possible. And I think that will become part of the ongoing war aim, if you like, in a way. And I think, you know, Raymond's point earlier about the priority to, you know, break the blockade and ensure that Ukraine is enjoying its maritime rights again will also be a major part of that effort. And, you know, that must happen as well.
Having said that, I'd just like to add one other thing. I guess because we don't talk about it, but they're victims everywhere. They're not just victims in Africa and in the Middle East, you know, because food prices are going to go up and energy prices are going to go up. But there are decent Russian people there too. As part of my work for the Department of Energy, you know, I visited a lot of facilities there during the Cooperative Threat Reduction Days, and there are many, many people in that country who want to join the West too. So the question is, what is the timing going to be on, you know, making sure that we haven't completely destroyed those in that country who are in favor of democratizing and bringing a different kind of system to Russia, and they're there. For those of us who've been in this field, it's tragic that it's even dangerous to try and contact them. But they are there, and I don't think they're going to change their views. If anything, they're going to be stronger by the end of it.
Yes, absolutely. We were saying the other day that, you know, it's only a few months ago, then we had two Russian professors debating the freedom of speech and academic freedom on this Zoom platform. Sue, I think it must be Sue from here in Oxford. Hello, Sue. Says, is it inevitable that dictators who've been all powerful for a number of years go mad? Secondly, who will pay for the Ukraine? Oh yes, she asked the same question. Who will pay for the Ukraine to be rebuilt when this dreadful war comes to an end? But is there kind of an inevitability about power? Hugo?
Yes, I think so. I think, you know, time and time again, we see this, you know, it's not madness as such, perhaps it is possibly a particular neurosis and slight mania. It comes from isolation, comes from people saying yes to you all the time and not saying no to you enough, etc. And I think being deluded that, you know, what you think and what you believe is right. And I do also think, and I said earlier, I think, you know, Putin's found God. He may have not found God personally, but he's found God for good political reasons now. And I think often dictators, I'm thinking of Mugabe and lots of people, you know, we've had them in our own cultures in Europe. And I think they eventually transition into some sort of mystical vision of their place in history. And I think that's when it becomes pretty dangerous. And I think they all do that. And we could call that madness, we could call it delusion. Yeah, but I think it certainly comes from longevity in power. But again, remember, these people intend to take absolute power. So they make their power pretty absolute in the run up to that mystical appreciation of their indispensability and their role. So it is a very dangerous business. Yeah, it is.
Also,
Sorry,
if you live like Putin has done in sort of 20 or 30 years of conspiracy theories, you do go, if not mad, you go very, very odd in the head. And he's lived 20 years of imbibing very bad history lessons, and history is extraordinarily dangerous subject if you get it wrong. And he's got it wrong in spades. He just hasn't listened to his history lessons.
There's a fantastic article in the FT a couple of weekends ago by Simon Sharma about that, you know, and about the danger of history and how it gets internalized and dangerous. Yeah.
Christopher, any comments?
Well, as a historian, Susan and I, we can agree that history can be dangerous, but it can also inform. So, no, I think that one other point I'd make real quick is that the nature of my colleague Emma Ashford has written on this and has a new book coming out, and the nature of, in particular, petrostates and states that are founded on resource extraction provide an additional lever of power for a megalomaniacal dictator like Putin, who can create the entire structure of the system such that all the power flows through him. You know, it's not there are oligarchies in the world as well, but in a traditional oligarchy, the oligarchs actually hold power themselves, and they're the ones who are supporting or propping up the guy at the top. Well, that's not the case in Russia, and I think partly that is enabled by his ability to tap into the wealth from Russian resource extraction in particular, which again we've touched on. This is all the more reason to diversify both the where we derive our energy from, but also the energy that we use.
Susan, you're nodding there, right?
No, I'm nodding with everybody's comments because there have been so many wonderful comments and so many interesting perspectives.
Yeah, so as a literary critic and a theatre critic, I recall the ending of Tamburlaine, Christopher Marlowe's great play, in which he dies of natural causes. But as he's dying, his greatest regret is that the world is going to lose him, and he doesn't know what will happen to the world. It's a great Marlowean humor. What do you think about these reports of Putin being ill and cancer and all the rest of it? Is this just hogwash coming from Russia, or what do you think? Raymond.
Well, I'll preface my remarks by saying that, I lived in Moscow in the 1980s, early 1980s, and there was Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and ultimately Gorbachev. But I learned by heart the Chopin funeral march as each leader died. But I would also say that the amount of resources, energy, and sheer fatuous attempts to divine anything from medical criminology, I became very, very skeptical. So I mean, I don't know. Frankly, I immediately pigeonhole anything about health and Putin into another box and leave it on my desk and don't think about it. he does he have blood cancer, as they call it? I mean, leukemia, that can certainly, can take you for a long time. It can take you for decades to die from that. And I don't really think there's much point in putting a lot of speculation on Putin's health, to put it bluntly. At the same time, I would say that it's pretty clear that from 24th of February, Putin's fate is sealed. I mean, he's not going to last as a leader of Russia as a result of this war. Don't ask me the mechanism by which he will be taken away or deposed, nor when, but it's absolutely certain he's not going to survive. That's my view.
Yeah, everybody's nodding on that. And again, going back to Shakespeare, we think of Julius Caesar, but we don't know who's going to play Brutus, but or if they will, indeed. Angela Preston brings us back to a very serious point here. There is a great power rivalry brewing between the US and Russia. How much is the invasion of Ukraine the product of competition? Susan.
Well, I think there has been competition, but I think one area, and please believe me, I'm not an expert in the oil and gas industry, but it's interesting who's lobbying what up on Capitol Hill about, I mean, Nord Stream 2 was already a huge issue long before this all came up. And now the folks down in Texas are eagerly getting themselves ready to fill the breach or whatever. And I think there has been a lot of petrochemical competition, perhaps, though we were an importer of Russian fossil fuels. So I don't know how to answer that. Maybe I should defer this to somebody else. I don't know how much of it was competition, though I do think that once NATO decided, if not out of area, then out of business, you remember that period where the NATO alliance wanted to be involved in out of area activities. I think that's when the shift really began to take place. That's all I can say. And yes, that might be regarded as a national security competition. I don't know, but I'm so intrigued to know what others think on this subject myself.
Let me make two quick points. First of all, the competition between the United States and Russia, and the competition between the United States and China at various stages in our several countries' histories, that has worked to the benefit of one party or the other, right? I mean, so triangulating this relationship was something that not so long ago, people who believed that the focus should be on China saw Russia and improving relations with Russia as an opportunity. That obviously has changed very dramatically because of Putin's war. The other thing real quick that I'd point out, some of which I've only just learned in the last couple of weeks, is that even in the context of some of the most intense competition during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was also cooperation at a working level on things ranging from dealing with infectious diseases and vaccination to the Arctic to space, right? And so we can all think of instances in which even again, during some of the most tense times of that competition, that did not foreclose the possibility of cooperation on issues of common interest. And so again, it seems impossible even to imagine that in the context of this war that's ongoing right now. But I do think it should speak to the policies that we are willing to undertake in the immediate term that may foreclose the possibility of cooperation at a later date. And that's what I think we should be mindful of, even if that kind of cooperation is impossible right now.
Do you know what the most extraordinary example of that cooperation was? We signed a megatons to megawatts program with the Russian Federation, and we downblended nuclear warheads and burned them up in America's nuclear power plants. So for 20 years, 1 in every 10 light bulb in the United States was powered by a nuclear warhead. from the Russian Federation. I mean, now that's cooperation, folks, but it's unimaginable, I think, after where we are now, but enough to make one feel sad about this whole tragic set of circumstances.
Michael, I would just add from the European perspective, I think it's a bit much of Putin to play the jilted party in Europe as well, because if you look back and think certainly commercially, but also politically, I mean, I think you've had the reign of Angela Merkel bending over backwards to integrate with Russia, to tie trade and be incredibly integrated, and Nord Stream 2 is a huge symptom of that. You've had Berlusconi's Italy and further, after Berlusconi as well, Italy also, terribly keen to do business with Russia, to open it up, to work both ways and to lean in, and the British were too. And I think, you can't be that much of a jilted party if you've been using chemical weapons on British soil repeatedly and with your agents. And so I do think he completely overplays it, that nobody let him in, nobody played with him, nobody leant towards him. I think it's completely unreasonable. He's also been a very powerful member of the OSCE. He could have done more there if he wanted to, and been more constructive and forward-looking there. So I don't reckon it's right for him to play the jilted party in Europe.
Again, nobody's defending this guy, but it is very interesting to note that he provided a lot of the intelligence on Afghanistan after 9/11. So I see it more as a series of lost opportunities, and we'll just have to consign this to the history books because we're in a completely new place today. Yeah. And it is a tragic war. It's a tragic war. I personally think it was somewhat avoidable, but we could have an honest debate about that. The bottom line is that what's going on now is going to change things, I mean, all over the world. And I just hope that we're going to be thinking long enough out to be able to mitigate some of the negative effects on ourselves and very specifically the rest of the world.
I think, Rose, thank you for that. I think Rose McGalley asked a question quite early on, actually, which I've kept till the end, because I think it's something that haunts quite a lot of people. And I think you've just been touching on it, Susan. So I'll ask you this question and then go to each individually, and then we'll start to bring the debate to a close. Rosemary says, how close do the panelists think we are to a thermonuclear war between the US and Russia?
Closer than we were 3 months ago, and that's too close. It's still a very, very, very low probability event. There's no question about that. But the likelihood of nuclear use is higher now than it was 3 months ago.
Raymond?
I agree with that last statement, probably higher than it was 3 months ago. I don't think it's likely, and I think it's very unlikely between the United States and Russia. For various reasons, or perhaps because Putin has made it his reason. The United Kingdom has become hate figure number one in Europe for Russia. So one hopes we won't take the short straw, but I personally think it's unlikely.
Susan?
Well, I'll just say briefly that I'm much more worried about an accidental exchange than anything deliberate, and for all the reasons I mentioned before. But another reason that maybe we should have some negotiations, if on anything else, just getting the nuclear question off the table. If we could get the Russians to agree to that, that would already be a big step.
And could we trust them if we did, Susan?
I'm sorry? Could
we trust them if they did agree?
Well, I think everybody knows what the penalty is for not getting this right. So in any case, I've said enough on this subject, but it's a great question.
Hugo.
I would listen to the other three speakers as the experts. I'm usually working on the humanitarian side of things rather than the military side. But I think it's certainly raised nuclear issues again, which in some ways is good because I think they've been slightly overlooked in the last 10 years as a massive threat to humanity. I think it's probably geographically a bit closer. I think the fault lines, the tripwires are geographically a bit closer now because Finland's border becomes one and Sweden's border. And I think, we'll see in the next few months whether Crimea becomes the line and Donbass rather than the official, Ukrainian borders. So if Crimea is announced as a new tripwire, then we're geographically closer in our fault lines too.
Sandy, with your director of the Voice of America previous hat on, what's your view on that? And in any case, are there any other things you want to say before we we bring this to a close?
Well, I would just say that I respect everybody's. When you first asked the question, Mike, I noticed an uneasy silence settled over the group. And I don't think anybody wants to be the one who predicts a thermonuclear war, or who guarantees there's not going to be one. I think we're a little more nervous about it, maybe a lot more nervous about it in some cases. And that in itself says something. It's sort of unthinkable and also untalkable in a way. I'm worried that there doesn't appear, I take as a given that there are some things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about and need to be. But I sure would like to be reassured that there's some vehicle in place for talking about how to end this. And I don't think it would hurt for us all to know something about that vehicle or the people who are running it. It would give us a little more confidence, especially given some potential changes in leadership in certain countries in the months and years ahead. So I'm very worried about that. Is there some structure in place to try to de-escalate this and bring it back down? And I'm not sure there is. That's my main concern. But let me do the usual, Mike, and thank you for that extra moment. We're very grateful to our panelists and to the very many people who tuned in from far-flung places to participate with us today. And we remain at the Free Speech Project in particular, and I know Mike's project as well. Grateful to Georgetown University for supporting what we've been doing during the pandemic, and to the authorities in Oxford who've cooperated with us too. It's been an extraordinary opportunity. We couldn't possibly bring everybody together like this once a month in any other fashion. And so Mike and I think, are intending to do it. Our next one is going to be about the rebirth of censorship around the world, and how frightening that is to see. And meanwhile, thanks to everyone, Jack DeJoy, the president of Georgetown, and Tom Banchoff, the vice president for international affairs, who helped us get this off the ground. And many people, John McCabe, who's our essential person in keeping the Free Speech Project afloat in Washington these days. And thanks to you, Mike, for your good partnership.
Well, thank you, and thanks to Hugo Slim, Raymond Asquith, Susan Eisenhower, and Chris Peeble. It's been a fantastic debate this afternoon, and riveting, really. And I'm very grateful, because it's been serious, and yet I know it's been engaging. I can tell that by the questions that have been coming in. It's been engaging for our audience. So thank you very much for all that you've done. As Sandy just said, we have a free speech at the Crossroads International Dialogues on Monday, the 6th of June, when we'll be discussing that issue of censorship, and we'll be back to 4 p.m. UK time, 11 a.m. US time for that on Monday, the 6th of June. An event tomorrow is the 17th of May at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. GMT. Colleen Parsons from Georgetown University will be talking about Olive Schreiner and the story of the African farm. And I think that's getting into colonial literature. And they'll be talking about how there's been a kind of an evolution of progress in relation to that book. So please join us for that in the Christian Literary Imagination series. My thanks as ever to those at Georgetown, as Sandy has already said. Also at Campion Hall in Oxford, to Dr. Nick Austin, the master of the hall, Sarah Gray, and Ying Ying, Campion Hall administrators. My thanks again to John McCabe. My thanks to John O'Connor, the regent at Blackfriars, and Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. I'd like to thank everyone who's participated today, who've asked questions, those of you at home have been listening to the debate. If we haven't answered any of the questions because of time constraints, we will endeavour to email answers to you. So thank you for your attendance, for all your support for our various series, and my thanks especially to Sandy, who helps so much with this in the organisation, with John in the organisation, and in the cooperation that we have together. We've been working well for 18 months. It's a bit of a milestone this time. So thanks, Sandy, for all you do. It's terrific. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, thanks again to the panelists. Thanks to everyone. Take care. Keep safe. Goodbye.